You're not losing your faiths. You're stuck on a frequency God never left. The problem is the noise you've been generating is louder than the signal. 3 years, maybe 5, maybe your whole adult Christian life. You've shown up, you've served, you've given. You read the word in the morning and prayed before you slept. And somewhere inside all that faithfulness, something quietly disappeared. Not God, you know He's still there. But the warmth is gone, the hunger you used to feel on Sunday mornings has been replaced by something closer to obligation. You don't say it out loud because it sounds like doubt. And doubt sounds like betrayal. But it burns underneath everything like a question you can't turn off. Why is God silent when I'm trying this hard? Here's the truth that no one is saying from the front of any church you've been in. That silence is a signal not of God's absence, but of a drift. A specific biblical, nameable drift. And the longer it goes undiagnosed, the wider the gap grows between who you are before God and who you've trained yourself to perform being. There's a pattern hidden across 3 completely separate places in Scripture. Elijah collapsing in a wilderness, a brother standing outside a celebration in fury, and a letter written to a church that was doing everything right. That reveals exactly why faithful, praying, serving Christians go spiritually numb. Each of those stories ends at a different door, but they share one diagnosis. And there's a single question asked once in Scripture, directly by God. That, when answered honestly, ends the drift immediately. That question is coming, but first you need to understand what actually happened to you. Somewhere along the way, quietly, gradually, without a dramatic moment of failure, you stopped being someone who knows God and started being someone who performs knowing God. These sound identical, they feel nearly identical, but they produce completely different internal conditions. The psychologist William James observed over a century ago that human beings are the only creatures capable of altering their behavior so completely to match a role that they lose contact with whoever existed before the role. Not through deception, through adaptation. You became so practiced at being a faithful Christian. That faithful Christian became the frequency you broadcast on, instead of beloved child who God knows by name. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. This is not a sin problem. It doesn't feel wrong, it feels responsible. It feels like maturity. What's dying inside isn't your faith. It's your expectation of intimacy. Your ability to tune into the frequency where God actually speaks. Consider Elijah. Not the Elijah of fire and impossible miracles. The Elijah of 1 Kings 19. The Elijah immediately after the greatest spiritual victory of his life. He called fire from heaven, he outran a chariot. He was on the right side of every measurable spiritual equation. And then at the height of his faithfulness, he ran. Not from defeat, from exhaustion. Because he had been living off the frequency of his calling, instead of the frequency of his identity as someone God loved. He collapses under a tree and says, "It is enough." And at that moment, you'd expect a divine correction. You'd expect God to say, "Get up, there's work to do, there are people who need you." But God sends an angel with bread. He lets Elijah sleep. And when Elijah wakes and moves to walk further, God stops him. The journey is too great for you. God's first response to spiritual exhaustion is not more spiritual production. It's restoration of the person beneath the prophet. That detail is not incidental. It is the diagnosis. But here's where the story inside the story lives. The thread most people completely miss. In Luke 15, Jesus tells a parable about 2 lost sons. The younger one left everything, wasted it all, came back broken. His father ran to him before he finished his sentence. That story is obvious. The other son never left. He stayed, he obeyed, he served every single day. And when the celebration started, he was standing outside the door, furious. Not from rebellion, from confusion. From the invisible wound of someone who had performed sonship so long. They'd lost access to what sonship actually felt like. He says to his father, "I have served you like a slave for years and never disobeyed you." 6 words cut through everything. Served like a slave. He lived in his father's house. He had access to every resource his father owned. But he had been broadcasting on the servant frequency, not the son frequency. And no amount of prayer, no sacrifice, no discipline added to his record would fix that. Because the problem wasn't what he was doing. It was who he believed he was while doing it. This is the invisible trap that faithful spiritual growth itself can build around you. And it's invisible precisely because it's constructed from good materials. Prayer, consistency, scripture, service, obedience. Not one of those things is wrong. But they can become the source of your identity instead of the expression of it. When that shift happens, when your practices become your proof, rather than your response to a love that needs no proof, something changes in how you approach God. You stop arriving as a child. You start arriving as an employee trying to justify continued access. And God, who never changed his frequency, who is still transmitting on the exact channel where he first called you by name, becomes harder and harder to hear. Not because he went anywhere, because religious performance generates interference. The harder you push to break through, the more static you generate. The more static, the harder you push. It's a loop, and it doesn't break by adding another discipline to the list. 3 years, 5 years, a whole decade of showing up faithfully, and feeling emptier than you did in year 1. When you knew almost nothing, but somehow heard everything. That's not a minor frustration. That's a quiet, sustained grief. Because what do you do when the very practices meant to connect you to God have become the static between you and him? In Revelation 2, Jesus speaks to the church at Ephesus. Not a corrupt church, not a weak one. A church that exposed false teachers, endured persecution, and worked tirelessly for his name with documented, verifiable faithfulness. The kind of church that every pastor would want to lead. And he looks at all of it and says, "You have left your first love." The church expected correction. Jesus gave them a prescription. Just 4 words: remember from where you have fallen. Not pray harder, not fast longer, not serve more. Remember. Return not to a doctrine, not to a discipline, but to a specific, personal, unrepeatable moment. The moment when God was not yet a system to perform for, but a person who saw you clearly and called you by name anyway. And this brings us back to Elijah at the cave on the mountain. After the bread, after the sleep, after God restores the human being underneath the prophet, God passes by in wind, in earthquake, in fire. Elijah does not move. And then in the silence after all of it, a still small voice. And the voice asks him one question. Not what did you do wrongs? Not why did you abandon your post? Just, what are you doing here? That question is not rebuke. It's an invitation to stop performing location and start confessing condition. To answer from beneath the prophet's mantle. To say the thing that sounds too small to be spiritual. I'm exhausted, I'm here because I have nowhere else to go. I thought this was supposed to feel different. That answer, raw, stripped of performance, embarrassingly honest, is the exact frequency God was waiting for all along. The biblical reset for spiritual stagnation isn't a new discipline. It's not a new prayer method or a structured reading plan. It is the practice of remembering specifically and personally. Going back not to the habit but to the moment. The moment before you had anything to offer. When your faith wasn't a practice to maintain, but a discovery that undid you. When God wasn't a God to perform for, but a father who saw you coming from a long way off and ran. That's the frequency. That's the channel where intimacy actually transmits. And it never stopped broadcasting. Nothing you did turned it off. The only thing that changed is what you started listening for. And what you started believing you had to become before you were allowed to hear. Here's what I need you to sit with. The older brother standing outside that door. We never find out if he walked through. Jesus left the parable without an ending. That wasn't an oversight. It is the most important narrative choice in the entire story. Because the ending belongs to whoever is hearing it. Spiritual growth is not the accumulation of faithful performance. It is the continuous return to the reason you were faithful in the first place. Not what you're doing for God. who you already are to God's. That shift is the only reset Scripture actually prescribes. The frequency hasn't changed. The voice on the other end hasn't gone anywhere. The only question is what you're willing to do with the silence you've been calling God's absence. Bring this question to God tonight, the one He asked Elijah. Answer it from beneath everything you perform. What are you doing here? That's where the reset begins. And if this kind of biblical teaching is what you've been looking for, subscribe because there's more waiting for you here.